Hi, my name is Christopher Malcolm, and welcome to Movable Canvas, where we talk about cinema, art, culture, and where those three things sometimes intersect. In today's episode, we'll look back at the best years of our lives. William Wyler's 1946 Best Picture winner starring Frederic March, Myrna Loy, Dana Andrews, and Theresa Wright. You know, one of my favorite still photographers is a man by the name of James Nachtwey. He's most famous for his kind of poetic black and white images from war zones and areas of conflict around the world. It's odd to say that any image of war and suffering could be beautiful, but Nachtwey's images are at once horrifying in their reality and unquestionably elegant in their execution. His renown is such that there was actually a 2001 documentary made about his life called War Photographer, which, by the way, is definitely worth the watch if you got a minute. But in it, Nachtwey, who's dedicated his entire life to documenting conflict and atrocities and has clearly paid the price on an emotional level, puts his work into a broader context. The documentary itself asks a larger question. Is documenting the real-life horrors in our world an act of war photography? Or can it actually be a form of anti-war photography? Can showing the reality of war beyond the sometimes glamorized valor actually help end war instead of celebrating it? When faced with what war and suffering actually is on the front lines, can any society really embrace the idea of sending their young men and women out into the battle? War is a complicated issue, both for those who fight it and for those on the home front. I admit to coming from something of a gilded generation, coming of age just after Vietnam, but before America's major engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was blessed by living in a time where there wasn't really any real danger that I was going to be drafted as a young man to go into action. My own father fought in Vietnam. Then, and still today, he carries with him the emotional scars of that experience. But he was one of the lucky ones. He made it home. But that level of trauma is not something one could ever really leave behind. And I think it was even more complicated with his experience because the war in Vietnam itself wasn't one that was universally embraced by U.S. citizens. As years go on, the legacy of America's involvement in Vietnam has only grown even more complicated. But at the time, my father was an 18-year-old kid who joined the Army in hopes he could earn enough money to get enough money for a college education. Decisions about who and where to fight and all that type of stuff well beyond his pay grade. National interests when it came to battle are far more beyond the control of those who actually do the fighting. You've probably heard the old saying, old men start wars, but young men actually do the dying. It takes our bravest and boldest citizenry to answer the call to defend our Union, to offer to lay down their lives in pursuit of a better future. But the actual soldiers themselves have very little control over their own deployment. My father was at once proud of his service, but at the same time grew skeptical of the bigger picture. There's a time in every soldier's life, I imagine, when they have to start to ask questions about why they are sent to fight the enemy, while at the same time being forced to do whatever is necessary just to stay alive. He then returned home to an America in a wave of protest. And to be clear, it's not an offense of U.S. foreign policy or anything like that. I just took a moment to imagine going to serve your country, barely surviving through unimaginable conditions, then returning home to your fellow citizens who you swore to fight for, and have them turn their back on you and calling you the true enemy. That's not to say that one side is right or wrong. War is complicated. Rather, I share that story because it's always somewhat of a struggle for me personally to process what it must have been like for a soldier being sent to war. Sure, they have 1,000,001 movies and video games trying to simulate battle, but to actually be in war, face to face with your own mortality, oftentimes just barely even into adulthood yourself, when every moment could be your last breath. I mean, I can't even fathom it. And I stand truly in awe of any man and woman brave enough to step forward and answer that call. When the best years of our lives was made in 1946, America had just finished its own engagement in a very different kind of war, World War II. I think it's safe to say that World War II is one of the last wars, I think, at least in terms of on-screen depiction, has been kind of universally accepted as the one that was, worth the fight. Whenever your country's on the opposite side of Hitler, I think it's worth fighting. But while the Allied side eventually won the conflict, if ever anyone really wins a war, despite the armada of World War II films that glamorize the soldiers' heroism, that victory was anything but a foregone conclusion. One of the things I like to do when I'm watching like a cold classic movie made during the early mid early to mid 1940s, is try to identify what was happening in the actual war at the time the film was made. Films like Mrs. Miniver, revered for its patriotism and calls for the Brits to stay strong, were made at a time when England was still very much at siege. When arguably the most romantic movie of all time, Casablanca, was made in 1942, it was viewed just as much as a patriotic war movie as a love story. When they started singing La Marseillaise in the Ritz Club, they were literally standing up to the Nazis on screen at a time when the Third Reich was very much still in its ascendancy. So when William Wyler decided in 1946 to tell a story of American soldiers struggling to reassimilate into society when they returned home at the end of World War II, the filming was very much of the moment. Much of Hollywood had mobilized to support the U.S. war effort during World War II. Many still had even taken up arms themselves and served overseas. So when they were telling the story of the complications that arise from returning home, they were telling their own stories. Our film is told through the eyes of three returning servicemen. Al Stevenson, played by Frederic March, is the eldest of the group. Stateside, he'd been a wealthy and very high-powered banker. During the war, he held the rank of sergeant. He returns home to a loving wife, played by Myrna Loy, who, well, I think every man wishes they could return home to Myrna Loy. And there are two children who have grown from childhood into kind of early adulthood in his absence. Their reunion scene with March at one end of the long hallway and Myrna Loy at the other is one of those moments that will make you cry no matter how many times you've seen it. But what adds the texture beyond these grand moments are the small gestures. When March surprises his wife by returning home, she wasn't quite ready for it. Myrna Loy has to hastily call to cancel her dinner plans. Not a big sacrifice for a returning soldier. But as Loy is calling to cancel and explains to her friend that Al has just come home, we get a small note where she has to explain to her friend who Al even is. It's just a small thing, but it's a subtle reminder that life has moved on while he was away. He's no longer sure where he fits in. When he then opens up presents he's brought for his kids, souvenirs that he's brought from the war, and he offers one to his son from his time in battle, the indifference with which his son accepts these tokens reflects the kind of distance between the tangible engagement of the soldier during the war and the more intellectual one of those of us back home. As I talked about earlier, I can try to understand my father's experience on an intellectual level, but there's something that soldiers who have actually been on the battlefield know that the rest of us will only ever really be able to imagine. Dana Andrews' character, Fred Derry, had a life that was the reverse reflection of Al Stevenson. Dana Andrews was just a run-of-the-mill soda jerk working behind the counter at a department store. During the war, he rose to the esteemed rank of captain as a bombardier flying high over the skies of Europe. While Al Stevenson's trajectory was from top to bottom, then returning home and going back to the top, Fred Derry's life started at the bottom, then his status only grew. His struggle coming home is how to square that new identity he developed in the battlefield with the economic reality he faces coming home. He's sworn to never return to the department store lunch counter, but at the same time, doesn't really have tangible skills aside from dropping bombs that would make him valuable stateside. His life is further complicated by a hasty wartime marriage to a woman named Marie, a good-time gal played by Virginia Mayo. Now, one look at Virginia Mayo, it's not hard to see why any man would really be tempted to, put a ring on it. But as he returns home with his captain's stripes, it becomes evident that she only ever really loved the flyboy image of Fred Derry. She had little interest in the man himself. And the very moment she sees him out of uniform, the glamour and romance pretty much quickly fades. One person who does see the real Fred is Peggy Stevenson, played by Theresa Wright. She's the elder daughter of Al Stevenson, she's like her early 20s or something like that. And her burgeoning romance with Fred Derry really forms the romantic center of the film. Unlike Fred's wife, Peggy actually sees Fred for who he is. She's not enamored with the title, she falls in love with the man. By the way, maybe I should call myself out or at least openly admit that my enjoyment of a lot of movies is caught off and tied to how in love with the female lead I happen to be. The fact that this film has not one, but two of my dream wives, in Myrna Loy and Theresa Wright, might have something to do with why it's one of my favorite movies of all time, or because it's just a darn good movie. But I digress. The third star of our film is Homer Parrish, played by real-life World War II veteran Harold Russell. The real-life Harold Russell lost both of his hands during the war, and the character Homer Parrish, while not a biography, leans heavily on his own experience, returning home with a disability that will really shape the rest of his life. He won a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his role, as well as a special honorary Oscar for bringing hope and courage to his fellow veterans during the war. While all three actors must struggle emotionally to adapt to their homecoming, Homer Parrish's wound remains permanently visible. He is welcomed home by his family, who loves him, and a fiancé still hoping to marry him. But Homer's struggle is believing that he's still worthy of that love. He is literally physically not the man he was before he left for the war, at least in his head. His journey is in accepting that his life still has value and finding the strength to go on. The thing that makes this film so special is that it captures the difficulties for both soldiers returning home and civilians doing their best to understand and support them, even when, at the time, it can be hard to know how. Produced during a time when the emotions and struggles depicted in the film were still very much occurring in real time, the film both honors the soldiers' heroism while simultaneously revealing their mortality. Al Stevenson can't just go back to his job at the bank with, doing business as usual. He's seen things now. He's looked men in the eyes on the battlefield and learned to judge them by more than just the collateral available or their bank book. Fred Derry suffers from a split personality, hungry to prove to the world that he's more than just a soda jerk, but constantly reminded by the world that he's nothing without his captain's stripes. Homer Parrish must learn to love himself again. And it's actually one of the civilian characters, played by Myrna Loy, who actually uses the phrase, the best years of our lives, during the film. That in itself is a suggestion that this is a battle we are all fighting together, both those who served and those who stayed home. The best years of our lives aren't because of the glamour or even the victory on the battlefield. The best years of our lives are when we reconnect with our loved ones, reconnect with ourselves, and reconnect with our understanding that our value as human beings is not determined by medals or titles. We all carry value simply by nature of being human beings, and that is to be cherished in good times and in bad. Thanks for watching another episode of Movable Canvas. If you like this kind of material, be sure to hit the little like and subscribe buttons below. I try to post an essay once a month where I talk about the best that Hollywood and the rest of the world have to offer. And please do leave me a comment. Have you seen The Best Years of Our Lives? I've seen it dozens of times. We just had the pleasure of actually seeing it on the big screen for the 80th anniversary. Definitely check that out if you get a chance. Which of the 3 service members do you most relate to? And have you or maybe one of your loved ones had a similar experience returning home from battle? I look forward to hearing what you have to say. But until then, thanks for watching and have a great day.